Bloomberg Audio Studios. Podcasts, radio, news.
This is the Bloomberg Daybreak Asia podcast. I'm Doug Krisner. You can join Brian Curtis and myself for the stories making news and moving markets in the APAC region. You can subscribe to the show anywhere you get your podcast and always on Bloomberg Radio, the Bloomberg Terminal, and the Bloomberg Business app.
Let's get to Tanvi Madan, Senior Fellow on Foreign Policy at the Brookings Institution, to talk a little bit more about the India elections. Tanvi, thank you for joining us. Now, you see comments like, even if Modi remains prime minister, his position will be much diminished. He won't be the same Modi. It puts the 8% growth target at risk. But I want to flip the argument a little bit and put this to you. Might this not be a good thing in that it shows democracy's working in India, and even smart, strong men need a check on their power?
I think the word you're hearing a lot from analysts, but also from voters, is balance, that the Indian voter has voted for more balance. And as you said, that's not necessarily a bad thing. You could see an argument made that Prime Minister Modi will continue some reforms, for example, on the economic side, but he will need to think about how to ensure more inclusive growth. The message from voters seems to be that India is shining for some, but not for many. And so I think you will see, it doesn't mean that you won't see the same direction, but I think there will have to be some tweaks and adaptations. But as you said, I don't think this is necessarily a bad thing. It shows that at the end of the day, the ultimate guarantor of Indian democracy are Indian voters, and they want choice, and they exercise choice.
So let's drill down into that if we can. How pervasive is inequality, joblessness, and inflation when it comes to the cost of living?
I think it depends from state to state. And one of the things that analysts will do in the next few days is drill down in each state and see what the signal has been. One thing we've heard, even in the state elections in the southern state of Karnataka a few months ago, where Bangalore is, that rural voters in particular were feeling economic distress, were upset about inflation and prices, and were pleased actually by Prime Minister Modi's welfare schemes, cash transfers, but they also want jobs. And so I think that's where you will see some of the focus as Prime Minister Modi tries to not just form a coalition, but think about what the policy priorities are going to be in the months ahead.
So those 30 seats that are controlled by the allies, the small parties, we did have the Telugu Desam party in Andhra Pradesh saying that they are reaffirming their support for Modi. Is it possible that not really all that much changes because the coalition will still be in power and Modi will still be the man?
I think where you will see change is from the fact that Prime Minister Modi is somebody who has never had to deal with a coalition government. He was a chief minister, or the equivalent of governor of the state of Gujarat, for a number of years. He's been prime minister for 10 years, but he's always had a majority. So there will have to be some change, even though it's only about 30, 40 seats that they need partners for. There'll be change from the fact that Prime Minister Modi now has to deal with coalition partners. I think the second thing that we'll see over the next few months is what this means for the party internally. What is their assessment of why they have lost? And I think there will have to be some adaptation. And if there is not, if Prime Minister Modi and his party, do not adapt and send a signal to voters that actually they're not acknowledging that the voters have sent a different message from 2019 and 2014, they will perhaps suffer greater defeats in future, not just national elections, but state elections as well. So I do think there will be some adaptation that's necessary.
I'm curious about what this may mean for foreign policy, particularly with India's relationship with Russia, whether we're talking about support for the conflict in Ukraine or the importation of Russian crude oil into India. Does it change the calculus on foreign policy at all?
Not really. I think foreign policy is one place that, even though you see the ruling party often say that everything has changed with Modi, where there is actually more continuity rather than change. Sometimes there's emphasis that differs, for example, on the diaspora or on cultural issues, but largely, whether it's the traditional partnership with Russia that remains, but has been both this government, the Modi government, and previous governments have been diversifying away from it to some extent. You'll see that continue. You'll see at the end of the day a recognition that even job creation needs foreign investment, and that's been coming mostly from the West. Writ large or from the Middle East. And I think so you'll see, I think, more consistency than change, maybe a change in pace, but not change in direction in foreign policy.
Tanvi, domestically, how much does this strengthen the hand of Rahul Gandhi?
I think this will definitely change his image in India. He was seen as somebody who, could not pull off a victory for the Congress party. And technically, he's not the leader. There's another leader of the Congress party, but he was seen as the face of it. And so I think it will in the voters' mind, but also in narrative. And I think that's huge, can be hugely important in Indian politics. In the narrative, the kind of image that the BJP has tried to portray him as a loser of sorts, has nothing, hasn't been able to kind of pull off victories. I think that will change a bit. I think the Indian voters have shown that they're actually not that willing to dismiss him as the BJP perhaps would like.
Tanvi, thank you so much for joining us. Tanvi Madan, Senior Fellow on Foreign Policy at the Brookings Institution.
We go to India next, where Prime Minister Narendra Modi has vowed to continue in his role, even though his party did lose a majority in Parliament. Let's bring in Haslinda Amin, Bloomberg's chief international correspondent for Southeast Asia. She is in Delhi, and she joins us now. Has, it's always a pleasure. I'm curious. It feels like we've witnessed what some are describing as a political earthquake. Can you give us a sense of what you saw as these election results came in?
Wow, it's such a stunning blow to Modi. I mean, when we were tracking the vote count, and, initially it started with, it's going to be a landslide victory for Modi. Then it went to it's getting really, really close. In the end, this is the largest democracy, and they voted against the status quo. They want change. We talk about how India is a rich country. We talk about India, how it's grown at 8%, which is the fastest growing economy among the G20. But that wealth has not been equal, and the people voted against that. It's been a blow. You talk about political earthquake. This is how it landed, really. Modi's BJP party secured 241 seats. What it needed for a majority was 272. Essentially, what it needs to do now is to get those votes from its allies. The problem is the leaders of the two allies are flip-flopping. They've been flip-flopping for the last couple of months. In fact, they joined the alliance only several months ago. So it remains to be seen if Modi can get them on his side.
In our stories, though, we are saying that a spokesperson for the Allies basically affirming support for the coalition. But it does give them some power. So it kind of raises the questions. If Modi is I wouldn't say a loser, but I mean, he's definitely in that category of not achieving quite what he'd hoped. Who has achieved a lot more, and how much power does it give them?
Needless to say, it is a weakened Modi. Modi was seen for a very long time as the strongman, unbeatable. I mean, since he came to power, which was a surprise 10 years ago, his power year after year after year. No one expected to see a weakened Modi. He talked about staying in power till 2047. That is when he targets India to be a middle-income country. Right now, if you're talking about an alternative to Modi, there isn't any. Nobody's ever talked about succession plan. But you are right. The power now lies with the regional leaders, those allies that Modi is after. We could see a hung parliament if both sides, the opposition as well as the BJP, fail to get that majority. So a lot is at stake right now. We don't really know for sure if Modi remains in power, remains the prime minister a week from now.
So, Haz, we've talked a little bit about the economic backdrop. I'm curious about Modi's Hindu nationalism and whether or not that played a role as well.
Well, I guess in a way it did play a role. I mean, Modi tried to rule the Hindus in the country. That means 80% of the population. But if you take a look at the most populous state out there, that is Uttar Pradesh, mainly Hindus. In fact, he recently erected the Ram Temple, which replaced a mosque, which was there since the 1850s. But then again, that did not translate to more votes for him. At the last election in 2019, the BJP secured 62 seats out of the 80 available up for grabs. This time round, that was reduced to only 40 seats. If you want to win the overall election, you need to win Uttar Pradesh. And so therein lies the evidence that, that Hindu nationalism that Modi has been touting all the time while he was in power for the last 10 years has not really worked.
So, I think we need to kind of put this in the category of another wealth divide story. It's evident that people at the lower end have suffered a little bit, even though India has seen dramatic growth rates and has a target of 8% ongoing. So what are the changes that Modi might have to put in place to satisfy those people who voted against him?
You talk about income inequality, right? I mean, income inequality is at the widest in 12 years. And when it comes to getting help from the government, 800 million people out of the 1.3 billion people get free grain from the government. Therein lies how poverty looks in India. Modi needs to ensure that wealth gets distributed more evenly to the people. He's concentrated, some say, on the wealthy in the country. He's concentrated on manufacturing, in getting investments. The likes of Google and Apple have made huge investments in the south of the country, but that's not translating to real jobs for the people, not translating to real wealth. So the question really is, what does he need to do? Or perhaps he needs to grow the services sector even more. Some like Rajan, who's a former RBI governor, he's been saying that services can create the kind of jobs that India needs right now. India needs structural changes, and if Modi remains in power in the next 5 years, he needs to look at that, raise consumption levels, raise the level, the quality of life for the ordinary Indian.
Haz, thank you so much for making time to chat with us, filling us in on the details surrounding the election in India, where Prime Minister Narendra Modi vowed to continue in his role after his party did lose its majority in parliament. Haslinda Amin, Bloomberg's chief international correspondent for Southeast Asia, joining us from Delhi here on Daybreak Asia.
Joining us now is James Demmert, Chief Investment Officer at Main Street Research. James, plenty of time to talk about the U.S. I wanted to get some reaction here to the strong reaction that we saw in the election results from Mexico and India. The landslide victory by Claudia Sheinbaum in Mexico rattled markets there. It strengthens the hand of the ruling leftist party. So that's one thing. And then the result in India may weaken Narendra Modi's hand. So I'm wondering if you've looked at this and whether there's any sort of invisible thread takeaway from these results for emerging markets.
Thanks, Brian. I think there are a number of takeaways here, and I think markets absolutely were not expecting this in Mexico or certainly in India, and it is definitely a blow to equities in this very pro-growth era that Modi's had. 800 million Indians, and as you mentioned, or was mentioned earlier, 640 million going to the polls was a big surprise, a big move towards the Gandhi administration and the big changes that they see. And this is not a positive for equities. There's no question. And that's why you're seeing the big sell-off, the significant sell-off, and even bigger in individual names and indexes. And we would suggest investors here, you want to use risk management tools here, stop losses, whatever, because even though Modi thinks that he may, gather enough to stay in power, it looks less likely and definitely an uphill battle for him and also for equity markets there. Yeah,
and I'm wondering whether or not it was a part of the stable situation for the dollar today. You would expect with lower Treasury bond yields and expectations now that, maybe the Fed is going to have room to cut rates. The dollar held in and we had a rally in the end. So currencies that maybe a little bit of a kind of a safe haven, is that going to be the case going forward, favoring haven currencies?
Yeah, I think whenever you have these kind of disruptions, and we've seen a lot of them over the last 30 years, there's going to be a flight to qualities, to stability. The US dollar is absolutely going to be a beneficiary of that. And it certainly saw that today.
So with bond yields down and the dollar down, we've entered this period here where it seems like, what we had before, which is bad news is good news, that's giving way to bad news is bad news. People want to see growth hang in there. It's a little bit of a concern, but it's not yet a scare, right? I mean, we haven't had dramatic economic data suggesting any sort of meaningful move down, right?
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I think investors continue in general to focus maybe on the wrong thing. I mean, you've got people, really parsing through the inflation data, which frankly has gone in the right direction, certainly lower over the last couple of years and closer to the Fed's target. And, jobs reports, they ebb and flow, but they, generally speaking, are healthy. So, in our view, this is a great setup for equities if you stop thinking necessarily about the economic data, which is generally speaking better, and focus more on earnings. I mean, the last 2 quarters, and we can get deeper into that, have been much better than expected to a wide degree. So earnings are what drive stocks once you get the Fed out of the way, and we think they are out of the way.
So if the Fed is out of the way, I'm imagining that you think, okay, they're going to still be in a position to cut rates this year. How much do you think we're going to see in terms of easing between now and December?
We've been of the thought that this economy growing at, north or around 4%, let's call it, and positive earnings, and particularly recently more broadening of that earnings growth, that the Fed may not have to do anything. And again, recent data, most specifically cooling jobs and inflation, suggests that they could cut. Now, that's super bullish. If they can cut in September, which probably the futures markets say possibly September, certainly November now, that's another layer of bullish data and potential strategy that would work for equities here. Our feeling is that equities continue to do fine, even if the Fed sort of stays out of the way and the economy continues to grow. And again, earnings continue to be where they are.
In fact, many would say that might even be better to have the Fed just stay what it's been doing, because once you start getting some cuts, some people will worry that there's something under the hood and all that. This is an interesting period that we're coming into here. No earnings, basically now for several weeks. And the Fed is, it's what it's saying. It's data dependent. So we can see the same data they see. So you're not going to get much of a surprise. They don't really want to surprise the market here. So do you think that the drift is lower or the drift is higher?
I would suggest, I hate to say this, it's kind of boring, but I think it's choppy. I don't think you're going to see an economy that gets real weak here, particularly here in the U.S., And I don't really think that you're going to see any significant more strength than we have. 4% is a higher growth rate than we've really seen in GDP for the last 10 years. So we've got an economy that seems to be much more resilient, growing at a much higher pace. And we don't think that it's going to accelerate a lot from here, but we also just can't see how it's going to sort of get, decelerate in any significance. So again, that's why we think the Fed doesn't necessarily certainly need to raise rates, and probably without meaningful deterioration, probably isn't going to be interested in cutting.
So what areas of the market do you like, James, as we wrap up here? Is it industrials, materials, given the economic sensitivity of those groups? Do you like artificial intelligence and the tech trade? Do you want to chase that? What do you favor these days?
Yeah, it's a new business cycle. You got the Fed out of the way. Earnings are going to drive stocks for the next 7 to 8 years. And we want to focus on where the earnings growth is going to be. That's tech and telecom because of the AI tailwinds. And then how does that affect everything else? Well, you got to own the financials like JP Morgan or healthcare, industrials, and the utility sector with the expanding grid to absorb all this energy we're going to need to run these chips. Going to be important sectors. So investors should be here and be bullish. Stocks are relatively cheap based on forward earnings. I think it's a great setup for equities.
Yeah. All right, James, thanks very much for joining us. James Demmert, Chief Investment Officer, Main Street Research.
This has been the Bloomberg Daybreak Asia podcast, bringing you the stories making news and moving markets in the Asia Pacific. Visit the Bloomberg Podcast channel on YouTube to get more episodes of this and other shows from Bloomberg. Subscribe to the podcast on Apple, Spotify, or anywhere else you listen, and always on Bloomberg Radio, the Bloomberg Terminal, and the Bloomberg Business app.